sports as we're seeing now, right? Well, the NBA is scheduled to return on July 30th, 31st. Can't even remember now. Baseball, even a week before that. And you talked about sports not returning because society right now isn't healthy. That is sort of the crux of your piece. What were your thoughts when you started working on this to write on this? And the inspiration of just looking at everything that's going on and saying, "Hey, I don't think we should be maybe doing this in this way right now."
Right. Well, it started really at in March when Rudy Gobert tested positive and the NBA, a lot of the players got tested, a lot of them came back positive, and I think that was kind of like when nationally we started to realize, we come to so many realizations as a culture through sports, and I think that moment was where we kind of realized that this is something that's really going to be serious. It's just we can't pretend it's happening someplace else. It's here, and so I started thinking about it then, and it made sense to me that things shut down, right? Because contact sports are impossible, really. If somebody is sick, you will get sick. If you're breathing across the line of scrimmage, or if you're, going up for a rebound with somebody, like just the opportunities for transmission are so high. And I became really interested in kind of looking at like studies out of South Korea and studies out of China about the transmission rates. There are all of these interesting studies that will show you, like in a Zumba class, the instructor had coronavirus, and there a large number of the students in that class got it. So, or choirs where people are singing is another vector. There was a call center in, I believe it's South Korea, where people would be sitting at desks across from each other, and there was a lot of transmission there as well. And so I think this tells us a little bit of something, right? Which is, respiratory droplets, obviously, and voices, yelling, which are all things that we do in sports, not just as players, but as fans too. And, I've been somebody who's played sports my whole life, not only, pick up basketball, but I also played roller derby for 7 years. And I've kept in touch with Women's Flat Track Derby Association and some people there, and they came up with this really interesting plan to return to play, which is very player-centric, right? Because they don't have the economic considerations that a lot of these leagues are facing. And it's all about, when is it safe for you to literally play a contact sport with someone in your community? And the way that they did it was they came up with a mathematical formula that looked at rate of transmission in a region per 100,000 people. And like you plug in your numbers, transmission, population, all this other stuff, and it comes out and gives you like a score of, and then on that score, you put yourself on one of 7, phases of returning to play. So that's where I started thinking about this. And then with everything that's happened and the numbers going up, I mean, for a while I thought, okay, let's see how these leagues in the United States return to play. We saw it happening, with baseball in South Korea. We saw it happening with soccer in Germany, and now in the UK and in Spain. And those are all places that dealt with the virus. But clearly, like, the rate of transmission in those EU countries and Asian countries is so much lower compared to what we're facing in this country that I think it's just, you can't ignore it. You can't pretend it's not happening. And I think there's a lot of kind of wishful thinking in our nation right now about this. It's one thing to say, okay, I'm going to go to a concert or a movie or whatever, a bar, restaurant. And it's another thing to say, I want you all to entertain me. And so you all have to do this for entertainment. So I just, kind of thinking about that. It's a real, we have a problem in this country where a lot of people are unwilling to pull in the same direction to get us past this. I mean, the real challenge we're facing as a nation now has nothing to do with sports. And we are not playing as a team in some ways. And I think that ultimately is kind of what we're facing at the moment.
Right. And I mean, I want to read an excerpt from the story actually that you wrote, which is touching on exactly what you just mentioned, where you're talking about, we want sports back, but as a society, we aren't willing to do what's necessary in order to get them back. We have a president, and I love this part. We have a president who won't wear a mask because it makes his ego look tiny. I howled at laughing at
that. Thank you. I did wonder about putting that in.
I love that you put it in, Jane. Loved it.
And psychopaths who follow him who follow him make all sort of convoluted excuses for why they can't do the thing that would let many of us just go about our business. And it lends to something that Dexter and I talked about when we were on the phone last night, where it's like, if we shut, because at the beginning of all of this, I was saying, can we shut down for like 8 weeks, everything, and then just figure it out? I feel like that's kind of what the European countries did that you're talking about. I feel like that's kind of what a lot of the world did, at least in some way. The number itself, 8, may vary, but they were able to shut everything down, and now they're looking a lot better than we are, where we're still in late June, almost July, and we have, coincidentally, some red states, but states nonetheless, Arizona, Florida, and Texas, really spiking up because they want to be on the other side of this so badly. And what it's doing is it's collaterally affecting everything else going on around them, as in the underprivileged communities that Black and brown people live in that aren't asking to be part of the spike. Now we're getting really, really hurt by this, because people who are Black and Latino don't really have the access to healthcare in the same way that other people do in this country. So is that something that obviously you thought about in all of this, and something you kept in the back of your mind?
Yeah, at 100%, because, again, it's the idea of who is the essential employee, right? The essential employee is often somebody who's paid low wages in order to do work that is not well compensated, and it is also not work that maybe a lot of people don't want to do, right? So, I remember the first couple of weeks when we were getting our groceries delivered. Every single time we had a grocery delivery, I would tip $40 cash to the person who dropped it off, because I felt like, okay, so you're risking in order to do this. This is the least I could do, literally saving me. Not just you're doing me a favor by delivering my groceries, but you are also going out into the world, and that's a different equation. Right? That's a different equation when we ask somebody to do that. So, and we as a nation didn't decide to compensate them to a large degree more. And so I do think that this is, it's not just an issue of what we want. It's also a moral issue of how we are. What are we ethically contributing, right? Like, we want, but we don't want to give. We want to take, but we don't want to give. And this is, in society, you make a compact, right? And I do think there's a lot to that. We're asking the most of the people that are least able to give it financially and from a health point of view. And I do think that's something. I mean, honestly, like, so, we have almost 200 students in our program, and one of them is one of my Black students was the first one who said to me, I have a lot of family members who are dealing with this. So, just even anecdotally early on, I was hearing, stuff like that, and keeping it in mind. And I do think that's a huge part of, I think, the problem with the NCAA allowing all of these football workouts to happen without having real safety and structures in place for these quote unquote student athletes. Again, out of all of the people in our pantheon of sports, we're asking the most of them, and they have the least, right? In terms of compensation, in terms of player representation, there are it's very much, I think, and I think we've all been sensitized to it. I certainly hope so, by the protests around the killing of George Floyd. That these are, you may not like to see these imbalances that are happening. But we certainly do see them we have them in sports, whether you choose to see them or not. And I think, and I think we as fans, and certainly as broadcasters and writers, have a responsibility to not shield our eyes anymore when it comes to this. I kind of, my daughters are very, very engaged politically, and they have asked me if I think that this time is different. And I don't know that it's different in terms of what's going to happen at a federal level in terms of laws. I am very cynical about that, but I do think the scales have fallen from our eyes in a way. Like, I think there's a large swath of America that's not going to be able to unsee a lot of the inequity that we see right now in societies. And I think it's playing out in sports in so many different ways as well.
How has, I guess, your students shaped your perspective maybe a little bit differently? Because now, I mean, it's not like you're just a journalist full time. You're working with a lot of kids. You mentioned, one of your Black students who knows a lot of people who has been affected by this. So I'm assuming that you've been talking to them throughout all of this, and how is that sort of dynamic added to how you're experiencing and processing just everything that's going on between obviously COVID-19 and then the protests and, these kids that you're managing, so to speak, for lack of a better word. They're about to step out into this world and look at what's going on as some of them are about to graduate.
Well, I think there also always has been a conversation around what is it we as journalists are allowed to say and observe, right? The idea that I just both sides it. If we have an issue that we're talking about, I say, what does this person believe? And then what does this person believe? And, it reminds me of that phrase that journalism is not asking two people what the weather is. It's looking outside and seeing if it's raining. Mm. And I think that a lot of people now are kind of coming to the idea, and we as people who are teaching are kind of looking at, well, we have to make sure that people can use their judgment about the rain in this situation. And I do think that oftentimes, I think women and people of color who come into journalism have been told that they can't have an opinion about things. They have to be completely neutral. And often that neutrality has been the universal white male voice. And it doesn't, and I think we're actually having more conversations about that, and students are having more conversations about that. And they're not as willing to say, okay, I want to adopt that voice. Now, that doesn't mean that we put our biases out there and we're writing opinion pieces, right. But it does mean that we're recognizing what we think. We're fully reporting around our blind spots and our weaknesses and talking to the people we may not think we agree with to make sure we're getting a fully formed, fair article. Now, is it, and getting all of the facts and doing the best service that we can for our readers so that they have all of the information available. But I don't think it's that we have to pretend that we don't see an unequal power structure, for example, or that we don't see that, in the NCAA, revenue generating sports are predominantly played by people of color, and that they're primarily profited off of by white culture and white institutions. So I think, those are the kinds of things I think that we're starting to talk about. And I think that's a good thing, honestly, to kind of put your blinders on and say, I don't see race and I don't see how it's affecting this story is no longer an acceptable way of looking at something or doing your job.